I never loved you the way you hoped I would." The words struck Felix harder than the summer rain pounding against the studio windows. His fingers loosened around the paper coffee cup until it slipped from his hand, splashing across the polished wooden floor. Neither he nor Hyungjin looked at the spreading stain. Time itself seemed to freeze inside the silent practice room, where only the distant rumble of thunder dared to interrupt the unbearable silence between them. Felix's heartbeat became painfully loud inside his ears. He searched Hyunjin's face for the smallest hint that it had all been a cruel joke. A smile, a laugh, anything that could erase the confession that had just shattered years of quiet hope. Instead, Hyunjin lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry." Apology hurt even more. Felix forced a smile that didn't belong to him. His lips curved upward while every part of his heart collapsed inward. "It's okay," he whispered, but nothing was okay. The room suddenly felt too small to breathe in. Every familiar object, the mirrors, the speakers, the scattered dance shoes, even the scent of sweat mixed with fresh coffee, became reminders of memories he wished he could erase. He remembered every late-night practice, every shared meal, every exhausted laugh after performances, every moment he had secretly mistaken for something more. Hyunjin had never lied to him. Felix simply chose to believe in a future that had never existed. Without another word, he bent down to collect the fallen cup. His hands trembled so violently that he couldn't even pick up the crushed cardboard. Hyunjin instinctively stepped forward. "Felix!" "No," answer came softly, yet it carried enough pain to stop Hyunjin where he stood. "Just need some air." Felix grabbed his jacket and walked toward the exit before the tears gathering in his eyes could betray him. The hallway outside was strangely quiet. Bright white lights stretched endlessly above him while distant echoes of laughter floated from another practice room. Somewhere, music played through old speakers, cheerful and energetic, mocking the storm raging inside his chest. He kept walking. Every step felt heavier than the last. He refused to look back. If he turned around even once, he feared he would run back inside and beg Hyunjin to change his mind. And Felix had promised himself long ago that love should never have to beg. Outside, the rain greeted him without mercy. Cold drops soaked through his hair within seconds, sliding across his face like tears he refused to shed. People hurried past carrying umbrellas, paying little attention to the young man standing motionless beneath the gray sky. The city continued living as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Cars rushed through flooded streets. Traffic lights changed from red to green. Coffee shops buzzed with conversations. Yet Felix felt as though the entire world had quietly ended. He began walking without deciding where to go. His shoes splashed through puddles. His phone vibrated several times inside his pocket. He ignored it. The screen continued glowing insistently. Hyunjin, Hyunjin, Hyunjin. Each notification tightened the ache inside his chest. Finally, Felix switched the phone off completely. Silence. For the first time all afternoon, silence belonged entirely to him. His thoughts drifted back to the first day they met. Hyunjin had smiled so brightly that even strangers seemed drawn toward him. Felix, awkward and shy, had been carrying far too many bags when one suddenly broke open across the hallway. Without hesitation, Hyunjin had knelt beside him, laughing while helping gather scattered notebooks. "You should really stop carrying your whole life in one bag," Hyunjin had joked. Felix had laughed. It became one of his favorite memories. Maybe that was the problem. Felix collected beautiful memories, the way some people collected photographs. He treasured every small kindness until they became impossible dreams. Rainwater blurred the glowing city lights ahead. He reached the old riverside bridge where they had often come after exhausting schedules. The river below flowed endlessly beneath the darkness. Felix rested both hands against the cold metal railing. The wind smelled of wet concrete and distant pine trees carried from the mountains beyond the city. He closed his eyes. "Be okay." Sentence sounded empty. He repeated it anyway. "Be okay." This time his voice cracked. He finally allowed himself to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, only quiet tears disappearing into the rain before anyone could notice. Several minutes passed, or perhaps an hour. Time no longer mattered. Somewhere behind him, tires screeched sharply against the soaked road. A woman shouted. Then came another scream. Felix opened his eyes. Bright headlights spun wildly across the bridge, reflecting against the rain like exploding stars. People began running. Someone yelled for help. Another voice shouted a familiar name. "Hyunjin?" "Here." The cry rose above the roar of the rain, raw with panic, and Felix's head snapped toward the sound before his mind had time to think. Instinct carried him forward. His feet pounded across the slick pavement as people scattered away from the overturned delivery van that had skidded sideways across 2 lanes of the bridge. A motorcycle lay on its side several meters away, its engine coughing weakly before falling silent. Steam curled from the crumpled hood of the van. The sharp smell of gasoline mixed with wet asphalt filled the air. Felix's pulse thundered. Then he saw him. Hyungjin stood in the middle of the chaos, soaked from head to toe, kneeling beside an elderly man who had fallen near the guardrail. Blood stained Hyunjin's sleeve where he had scraped his arm while pulling the man away from the motorcycle. For one suspended heartbeat, Felix forgot everything that had happened inside the practice room. All he saw was Hyunjin reaching desperately toward someone else instead of protecting himself. "Sir, stay with me," Hyunjin pleaded, his voice shaking. "An ambulance is coming." The old man's breathing was shallow. His frightened eyes searched the faces around him as though trying to remember where he was. Felix rushed over without hesitation. "What happened?" Hyunjin looked up. Their eyes met, neither of them spoke. The confession from earlier still hung invisibly between them, heavier than the storm clouds overhead. "A car lost control," Hyunjin said quietly. He pushed his granddaughter out of the way. Only then did Felix notice the little girl sitting on the wet pavement nearby, wrapped in a stranger's jacket. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her tiny shoulders trembled uncontrollably as she clutched a stuffed rabbit whose white fur had turned gray with rainwater. Felix slowly crouched beside her. "Hey." She didn't answer. Her wide eyes remained fixed on her grandfather. Felix removed his own jacket and gently draped it over her shoulders. "He's fighting," Felix whispered. "So you have to be brave, too." The little girl finally looked at him. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. She nodded once. A distant siren echoed through the city. People stepped aside as paramedics hurried across the bridge carrying emergency equipment. One medic immediately examined the elderly man while another cleaned the cut on Hyunjin's arm. "It needs stitches," the medic said. "I'm fine," Felix said automatically. Hyunjin blinked in surprise. Felix realized what he had said and looked away. "I'm just saying you should let them treat it." Hyunjin studied him for a moment before giving the medic a quiet nod. The ambulance doors slammed shut a few minutes later. The old man and his granddaughter disappeared into the flashing lights before the vehicle sped into the rainy night. Silence settled over the bridge again. Only scattered debris remained as evidence that anything had happened. Felix leaned against the railing, staring at the river below. Hyunjin stood several feet away, keeping the distance Felix himself had created. "I called you," Hyunjin said after a long pause. "I know. You turned your phone off. I needed to." Rain softened into a gentle drizzle, streetlights shimmered across the dark water like broken ribbons of gold. "I shouldn't have told you like that," Hyunjin said. Felix let out a slow breath. "You told me the truth. I still hurt you." Felix smiled faintly, though the sadness never left his eyes. "Truth usually does." Hyunjin lowered his head. "Been carrying guilt for months." Felix frowned. "Guilt? I knew how you felt." Those words landed almost as painfully as the confession itself. "I noticed the way you looked at me," Hyunjin continued softly. "I kept pretending I didn't because I was afraid that if I acknowledged it, I'd lose you." Felix closed his eyes. "So you chose silence." "I chose cowardice." Neither of them spoke for several moments. Rain dripped rhythmically from the bridge cables. Somewhere across the river, a train passed, its distant horn echoing through the night. "I wasn't asking you to love me," Felix finally said. "I know. I just wanted honesty." Hyunjin nodded slowly. "You deserved that from the beginning." Felix looked at him for the first time since leaving the studio. Hyunjin looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. His shoulders, usually so straight and confident, now seemed burdened by something invisible. For the first time, Felix realized Hyunjin had been suffering too, not because he didn't love Felix. Because he hated being the reason someone precious was hurting. The realization didn't erase Felix's pain, but it changed its shape. The bitterness that had been growing inside him slowly gave way to something quieter, acceptance. Not complete, not easy, but real. Without another word, the two of them began walking across the bridge side by side. They didn't touch. They didn't force conversation. They simply listened to the fatting rain and the distant heartbeat of the city, carrying with them the quiet understanding that some relationships survive not because love becomes romance, but because honesty finally arrives before it's too late. Morning arrived beneath a sky washed clean by the night's rain, but the heaviness inside Felix remained untouched. Sunlight poured through the apartment window, tracing pale lines across the wooden floor. His alarm had been ringing for nearly 5 minutes before he finally reached over to silence it. For a long moment, he simply lay still, staring at the ceiling, replaying Hyunjin's words until they blended with the memory of the bridge, the frightened little girl, and the old man whose life had nearly ended in an instant. Somehow, those moments had changed something inside him. Pain was still there. It simply no longer demanded to be heard every second. Felix dressed quietly and left before the city was fully awake. The streets still smelled of rain, and tiny drops clung to the leaves lining the sidewalks. He slipped his headphones over his ears but never pressed play. Today, silence felt more honest than music. When he arrived at the studio, the familiar hallway buzzed with laughter and footsteps. Staff members hurried from room to room carrying equipment, while dancers stretched in the corners, preparing for another long rehearsal. Everything looked exactly the same, only Felix felt different. He entered the practice room without looking around. A few of the others greeted him with cheerful smiles. "Morning, Felix," he smiled politely. "Morning." Then he noticed Hyunjin. He was already warming up alone near the mirrors, moving with his usual precision, though there was a noticeable hesitation in every movement. For the briefest second, their eyes met. Neither smiled, neither looked away immediately. Instead, they exchanged a quiet nod, a simple acknowledgement that yesterday had happened, and that pretending otherwise would only reopen the wound. The rehearsal began. The music exploded from the speakers. Every beat demanded absolute concentration. Felix threw himself into the choreography with everything he had. Sweat gathered along his forehead as hours slipped by. His muscles burned, but the physical exhaustion was strangely comforting. Unlike heartbreak, fatigue had a clear cause and an obvious cure. Across the room, Hyunjin danced with the same determination. Whenever their positions brought them close, they remained perfectly professional. Their timing stayed flawless, their expressions focused. Anyone watching would have seen two performers working together as they always had. Only they knew how much effort it took. During the lunch break, Felix slipped outside with a bottle of water. The rooftop overlooked the city, where countless buildings shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers from a nearby park. He closed his eyes. "You always come up here when you're thinking too much." Felix smiled faintly before turning around. Hyunjin stood near the rooftop door holding 2 cups of iced coffee. "I guessed you'd skip lunch." Felix accepted one of the cups after a brief hesitation. "Thanks." For a while, neither spoke. The quiet no longer felt uncomfortable. "I visited the hospital this morning," Hyunjin finally said. Felix looked up. "Grandfather is awake." A small smile appeared on Felix's face, and the little girl, she refused to leave his side. Felix laughed softly. "I figured she wouldn't." Hyunjin nodded. "She asked about us." Felix raised an eyebrow. "Us? She thought we were brothers." Felix couldn't help smiling. "What did you tell her?" Hyunjin stared at the city for several seconds before answering. "I told her we're family in a different way." The words lingered in the warm afternoon air. Felix realized that, despite everything, he didn't hate hearing them. There had once been a time when he believed the only ending worth accepting was one where Hyunjin loved him the same way. Now, he wondered if there were other endings that could still be beautiful. Not every love story had to become a romance. Some became forgiveness. Some became loyalty. Some became the quiet promise to stay, even after dreams had changed. The wind fluttered the edges of Felix's jacket. He took a slow sip of coffee. "It's going to take me a while," he admitted. "I know. I don't want to keep running." Hyunjin looked at him, relief softening the tension that had lived on his face for days. "I'll wait." Felix smiled. "For my feelings?" Hyunjin blinked. "My trust." Hyunjin lowered his head. "As long as it takes." Sun drifted lower across the horizon, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. For the first time since hearing the confession, Felix felt something fragile beginning to grow beneath the broken pieces of his heart. It wasn't hope for the future he had imagined. It was hope that, even after losing one dream, life could still offer another. The following week arrived with a relentless schedule that left little room for anyone to dwell on private emotions. Before sunrise, the practice rooms were already alive with music. Choreographers called out counts over pounding bass, managers checked timetables, and cameras captured behind-the-scenes footage for an upcoming project. The familiar rhythm of work settled over everyone like a second heartbeat. Felix welcomed it. The busier he stayed, the less time he had to replay conversations he could no longer change. Yet healing was rarely as simple as exhaustion. Every now and then, his eyes would instinctively search for Hyungjin across the room. Sometimes they met for only a second before returning to rehearsal. Sometimes they didn't meet at all. There was no awkwardness anymore, only an unspoken respect for the space each of them still needed. Late one evening, after nearly 10 hours of practice, the members finally dispersed. Most hurried home, eager for dinner and sleep, but Felix lingered behind to organize a stack of notebooks filled with choreography notes. The studio had grown unusually quiet. Only the soft hum of the air conditioner remained. As he zipped his bag, he noticed a folded sheet of paper lying near the mirror. It had no name written on it. Curious, he unfolded it. Inside was a sketch. Someone had carefully drawn the old riverside bridge beneath a rainy sky. Two figures stood side by side against the railing, their faces hidden, while sunlight quietly broke through the clouds in the distance. At the bottom of the page, only one sentence appeared. Some storms don't separate people. They teach them how to stand together differently. Felix stared at the handwriting. He recognized it immediately. Hyungjin. A gentle smile touched his lips. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his notebook instead of throwing it away, not because it erased the past. Because it honored it. When Felix stepped outside, evening had settled over the city. The streets glowed beneath rows of warm lights, and the air carried the comforting aroma of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. His phone vibrated. A message from Hyungjin appeared. Want to grab dinner? Just as friends. No pressure if you're not ready. Felix looked at the screen for a long moment. A week ago, he would have answered with hope. Now he answered with honesty. I'd like that. Restaurant they chose was small and quiet, tucked away on a side street where few people recognized them. Steam drifted from bowls of hot soup while soft jazz played through hidden speakers. Conversation came slowly at first. They talked about rehearsals, new choreography, a movie they both wanted to watch, nothing more, nothing less. Then Hyungjin laughed after accidentally dropping his chopsticks. The sound caught Felix off guard. It was the same laugh that had once made him fall in love. This time, though, it no longer carried the same ache. It simply sounded familiar, comforting, human. As they left the restaurant, snow began to fall unexpectedly, the first flakes of the season drifting gently through the glow of the streetlights. Felix lifted his face toward the sky. It's early, he murmured. Hyungjin smiled. Looks like winter couldn't wait. They walked in silence as snowflakes settled across their coats and hair. For the first time in many days, Felix realized he wasn't counting what he had lost. He was noticing what still remained. Trust was slowly returning. Friendship had survived. And although love had changed its shape, it had not disappeared. It had become quieter, kinder, freer. Felix looked ahead, watching the snow cover the streets in white, and felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. Some endings, he realized, were never meant to feel like victories. Sometimes, the bravest ending was simply accepting the truth, carrying the memories with gratitude, and continuing to walk forward with someone who still mattered, even if the path they shared had become different from the one he had once dreamed of.
Winter settled over the city with quiet determination, softening rooftops with fresh snow and wrapping familiar streets in a silence that felt almost sacred. Weeks had passed since the rainy evening on the bridge, and life had gradually found a new rhythm. Felix no longer woke with the same crushing weight in his chest. Some mornings were still difficult. Certain songs, certain places, or even the scent of coffee drifting through the studio could unexpectedly pull him back into memories he thought had already faded. But those moments no longer controlled him. They arrived, lingered for a while, and eventually drifted away like snowflakes melting against warm skin. The group's preparations for their next performance entered the final stage. Every rehearsal demanded perfection. Hours blended into one another beneath the bright studio lights. Shoes scraped across the polished floor. Heavy breathing filled the room after each run-through, followed immediately by another attempt. During a short break, Felix sat against the mirrored wall, wiping sweat from his forehead with a towel. Hyungjin walked over carrying 2 bottles of water. Without a word, he handed one to Felix. Thanks, Hyungjin smiled. You almost forgot to drink again. Felix laughed quietly. Guess some habits never change, some never should. Simple exchange felt natural. Neither of them searched for hidden meanings anymore. Their friendship had slowly rebuilt itself, not by pretending the past had never happened, but by accepting that it always would. A few days later, they returned to the Riverside Bridge, not because either of them had planned it. Their evening practice had ended earlier than expected, and they found themselves walking through the familiar streets until the bridge appeared ahead, illuminated by rows of golden lights reflecting across the calm river. Felix rested his hands against the cold railing. Weather's nicer this time. Hyungjin looked toward the water. It is. Several minutes they simply stood there, listening to the quiet flow of the river. Finally, Felix spoke. You know, I used to think loving someone meant hoping they'd eventually love you back. Hyungjin remained silent, allowing him to continue. But I don't believe that anymore. Felix smiled faintly. I think real love also means wanting someone to be honest, even when the truth hurts. Hyungjin lowered his eyes. Grateful you stayed. Felix turned toward him. I almost didn't. I know. If I'd walked away forever, I would have lost more than a dream. The wind carried snowflakes gently across the bridge. I would have lost one of the people who helped shape my life. Hyunjin's eyes glistened beneath the streetlights. You did the same for me. Words were simple. They didn't promise forever. They didn't erase old wounds. They simply acknowledged something that had always been true. Their connection had never depended on romance alone. It had been built through years of shared struggles, laughter, failures, victories, and quiet moments that neither of them would ever forget. As they began walking home, the city sparkled beneath the winter sky. Felix looked upward. The clouds that had once carried storms had finally drifted away. For the first time in a long while, he felt completely present, not trapped by what could have been, nor anxious about what might come next, only grateful for where he was. Some stories ended with declarations of love. Some ended with dramatic goodbyes. Theirs ended with something quieter but no less meaningful. Two people choosing kindness over regret, honesty over illusion, and gratitude over resentment. The road ahead remained uncertain, as every future does. But whatever waited beyond the next sunrise, Felix stepped toward it with a lighter heart, carrying not the pain of rejection, but the quiet strength that comes from accepting the truth and finding peace within it. Several months later, spring quietly returned to the city. The snow that had blanketed the streets all winter had disappeared, replaced by rows of cherry blossoms whose pale pink petals drifted through the warm afternoon breeze. The river beside the old bridge reflected a sky so blue that it seemed almost unreal, as if the storms of the past had belonged to another lifetime. Life had continued moving forward, so had Felix. Their latest performances had been successful, schedules were busier than ever, and the days were once again filled with rehearsals, interviews, recordings, and long nights spent perfecting every detail. Felix still worked as hard as he always had, but something inside him had changed. He smiled more easily, he laughed without forcing it. The quiet sadness that had once followed him everywhere had finally loosened its grip. One afternoon after rehearsal ended, Felix remained alone in the practice room. The mirrors reflected the fading sunlight pouring through the windows. He sat on the wooden floor, stretching sore muscles while absent-mindedly watching tiny dust particles dance in the golden light. The door opened softly. Hyunjin stepped inside. I thought I'd find you here. Felix smiled. You always do. Hyunjin sat beside him, leaving the same respectful distance he always had. Neither of them seemed bothered by the silence anymore. It had become familiar, comfortable. I found something while cleaning my apartment, Hyunjin said. He reached into his backpack and carefully placed an old photograph on the floor between them. Felix picked it up. It was taken years ago. The two of them were much younger, standing outside the practice building after one of their earliest evaluations. Their clothes were soaked from rain, their hair was a mess, yet both of them were laughing so hard that the camera had captured neither with their eyes open. Felix couldn't help laughing again. Remember this? You cried because we thought we'd failed. Felix groaned dramatically. And then you bought me 2 ice creams because you said one wasn't enough to fix a broken heart. Hyunjin laughed. I couldn't afford 2. You borrowed money. I did. They both laughed until tears gathered in the corners of their eyes, not tears of sadness, only the kind that appear when old memories become unexpectedly precious. Felix looked back at the photograph. We've changed. Hyunjin nodded. A lot. Somehow we're still here. Felix carefully slipped the photograph back into Hyunjin's hand. Keep it. Hyunjin looked surprised. You sure? Felix smiled warmly. I don't need pictures anymore. What do you mean? I already know those memories aren't going anywhere. Hyunjin looked at him quietly. For the first time since everything had happened, he saw no trace of hidden pain behind Felix's smile. Only peace, real peace. They left the studio together just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Cherry blossom petals floated across the sidewalk, carried gently by the evening wind. People hurried home after work. Children laughed in a nearby park. The city glowed with ordinary life. Felix paused for a moment. Watching a young boy chase the falling petals while his father laughed behind him, he smiled. There had been a time when he believed losing one dream meant losing everything. Now he understood that life rarely closed one door without quietly opening another. Not every blessing arrived in the form we expected. Sometimes healing arrived as forgiveness, sometimes it arrived as acceptance, and sometimes it arrived so slowly that we only recognized it after looking back. As they reached the familiar intersection where their paths separated, Hyunjin stopped. "See you tomorrow," Felix answered without hesitation. "Tomorrow." Hyunjin smiled before turning toward home. Felix watched him disappear into the evening crowd. Then he looked ahead. The road before him stretched beneath the golden light of sunset, calm and inviting. He took a deep breath and continued walking, no longer searching for the future he had once imagined. Instead, he welcomed the future that was waiting for him, carrying with him a heart that had been broken, healed, and quietly transformed by the courage to let go. Years passed more quietly than either of them had expected. The world continued to change around them. New songs were written, new stages were built, and countless faces filled arenas with cheers that echoed long after the lights faded. Success brought endless travel, sleepless nights, and memories scattered across cities they barely had time to explore. Through it all, one thing remained unchanged. Whenever life became overwhelming, Felix and Hyunjin still found themselves talking, not because they needed to, because they trusted each other. One autumn evening, after finishing a concert overseas, the group returned to the hotel exhausted. Most disappeared into their rooms without a word, eager for sleep after the long flight. Felix, however, stepped onto the rooftop terrace. The city below shimmered beneath thousands of lights. A cool breeze carried the scent of rain that had not yet fallen. "You still do this?" Felix turned and smiled. Hyunjin stood in the doorway holding 2 paper cups of hot chocolate. "I guess I do." Hyunjin handed him one. "No coffee tonight. I figured we'd earn something sweeter." Felix laughed. "I won't argue with that." They stood quietly beside the glass railing. Far below, traffic flowed like rivers of light. "Been thinking," Hyunjin said after a while. "That sounds dangerous." "Usually is." Felix smiled into his cup. Hyunjin looked out at the skyline before continuing. "If I had hidden the truth any longer, I think we would have destroyed everything." Felix nodded slowly. "I used to wish you'd given me a different answer. Now I'm grateful you gave me the honest one." Hyunjin looked at him with quiet relief. "Carried that guilt for a long time. You don't have to anymore." The words came gently, without hesitation. "Forgave you a long time ago." Silence that followed wasn't empty, it was peaceful. For years, both of them had unknowingly carried the weight of that single conversation. Now, at last, it felt as though they had finally set it down. A few drops of rain began tapping softly against the rooftop. Neither of them moved. "It always rains when we have important conversations," Hyunjin said with a smile. Felix laughed. "Maybe the weather has good timing." Rain grew steadier, cooling the warm night air. Instead of running inside, they remained where they were, watching the city blur beneath the falling rain. Felix closed his eyes for a brief moment. He no longer remembered the exact pain of that day in the practice room. Memory had softened it. What remained was not heartbreak, it was gratitude. Gratitude for honesty, for forgiveness. For a friendship strong enough to survive disappointment without turning into resentment. When they finally headed back inside, Felix paused near the doorway. "You know something?" "What?" "I'm glad I didn't leave that day." Hyunjin smiled. "So am I." They walked down the hallway together, their footsteps echoing softly through the quiet hotel. Outside, the rain continued to fall over the sleeping city. Inside, 2 friends carried no unfinished words, no hidden expectations, and no lingering regrets. Only the quiet certainty that some people enter our lives not to become the love story we imagined, but to become the kind of family we choose. And sometimes, that kind of love lasts the longest of all.